quite strange. I think the horse did a very good job in staying upright because although he fell, he didn't roll over, which would have been much more painful.
The quiet halls of Windsor Castle have long been the bedrock of royal tradition. But behind the scenes, a fierce battle for the estate's future is threatening to tear the family apart. Following a series of controversial financial revelations and unauthorized access claims involving the Windsor properties, Princess Anne, the family's most formidable enforcer, has officially stepped in. Armed with a dossier of internal grievances, the Princess Royal has issued a final, unequivocal warning to Queen Camilla. It is a confrontation that pits the iron-willed protector of tradition against the current administration, leaving the monarchy on the precipice of its most significant internal rupture in decades. The breaking point. The atmosphere inside Windsor Castle has shifted. It is no longer defined by the quiet rhythm of royal duty. It is defined by a deep, palpable tension that radiates from the private offices of the senior royals. For weeks, the corridors have echoed with the sounds of hushed conversations and the slamming of doors. At the center of this storm lies the Windsor estate itself. It is a sprawling, historic property that serves as the heart of the monarchy. Lately, however, it has become the stage for a standoff that threatens the stability of the entire family. Princess Anne has spent her life as the silent, reliable bedrock of the institution. She is the one who handles the logistics that no one else wants to touch. She respects the history of the estates and the strict protocols that come with their management. Recently, she came across a series of documents regarding the current management of the Windsor property. These records detailed a new, experimental approach to estate leases. The plan suggested moving away from long-standing tradition in favor of modern, high-turnover administrative models. Anne did not wait for an official meeting to address this. She went directly to the records room at dawn. She spent hours reviewing the financial ledgers, lease agreements, and maintenance logs. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. Decisions regarding the estate were being made without the traditional oversight of the Senior Advisory Council. These changes were being pushed through by a small, hand-picked group operating under the current administration. The Princess Royal has never been one to mince words when the integrity of the crown is at stake. She gathered her findings into a single, comprehensive dossier. It was not a request for a meeting. It was a clear, documented case of administrative overreach. She walked to the Queen's private quarters with the file under her arm. The look on her face was enough to warn the staff to clear the hallway. This was not a disagreement about policy. It was a confrontation about the future of the Windsor legacy. The Queen's office has tried to dismiss these concerns as modernization. They argue that the estate must adapt to stay relevant and financially sustainable. They view the old guard's insistence on tradition as a hurdle to progress. But for Princess Anne, this is not about progress. It is about protection. She believes that once you start dismantling the traditional protections of the royal estates, you lose the very foundation that gives the monarchy its enduring power. The mystery that has the household staff whispering is how the king will respond. He is the owner of the estate, but he is also the person caught between the two women who represent the past and the present of his reign. He values his sister's dedication to the old ways, but he has also relied on his wife's modernizing influence to refresh his image. He has spent the last month trying to stay above the fray, but the fray is now sitting in his own living room. Every day that passes, the divide grows wider. Security protocols have been tightened at Windsor, and there are rumors that the princess has started her own internal audit. She is not just challenging the new policies, she is actively working to undo them. The Queen's team is now struggling to keep their projects afloat, as the princess blocks their access to key decision-making channels. It is a cold war being fought with files, leases, and the iron will of the most respected member of the royal family, the Heritage Act dossier. Princess Anne spent 3 full days in a windowless room in the bowels of the royal archives. She wore a simple dark jumper and carried a thermos of tea. She was not there for a ceremonial visit. She was there to build a case. She systematically cross-referenced land deeds from the 19th century with the current revised management contracts. By the end of the 3rd day, she had compiled a document that she titled the Heritage Act Dossier. It was over 60 pages of detailed, annotated evidence. The core of the dossier is a list of what Anne calls administrative erosion. She documented how small, seemingly harmless changes to property maintenance contracts were being used to bypass the traditional oversight committees. She proved that historic parts of the Windsor estate, long held as sacred, were being reclassified as commercial assets. This change meant they no longer required the same level of protection or traditional vetting. It was a bureaucratic sleight of hand. She didn't just leave the dossier on a desk. She hand-delivered it to the Queen's private secretary. She made it clear that she expected a formal response within 48 hours. The document was a direct challenge to the modernizing agenda that Camilla's team has been pushing. It wasn't just a critique. It was a legalistic, historically grounded argument that claimed the Queen's office was effectively violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the Crown's own founding charters. The staff reported that the Queen's office went into panic mode after reading the first 10 pages. They realized that Anne hadn't just looked for gossip. She had found the structural weaknesses in their new strategy. They started working around the clock to draft a rebuttal, but they faced a major problem. They couldn't refute the facts. Anne had attached copies of the original land grants and the recent altered contracts side by side. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. This is why the dossier is considered a strategic weapon rather than a simple inquiry. Anne knows that the public cares about the preservation of royal heritage. If this information were to leak, it would turn the narrative against the Queen's administration instantly. It would frame her not as a modernizer, but as someone who is putting the Crown's most sacred assets at risk for the sake of administrative convenience. It is a high-stakes gamble that uses the institution's own rules against the current leadership. The mystery remains whether Anne intends to make the dossier public if her demands are not met. She has been very quiet about her next steps. She has not spoken to the press. She has not shared the document with other family members. She is keeping her cards close to her chest, using the threat of the disclosure to force the Queen's team into a corner. She is effectively holding the administration hostage with their own paperwork. The Queen is feeling the pressure. She has been forced to pause several of her most ambitious projects at Windsor, while her legal team reviews Anne's findings. The momentum that the Queen's office had built over the last 6 months has hit a dead end. Every new initiative is now being run through a filter of heritage compliance that Anne's team has established. The power dynamic in the castle has shifted from the Queen's office back to the traditionalist stronghold. This is a clear warning that the era of uncontested administrative freedom is over. Anne has signaled that she is watching every move. She is not satisfied with the current direction, and she has the patience to dismantle their plans one layer at a time. The Queen is now fighting a defensive battle, trying to maintain her agenda while the Princess Royal systematically strips away her authority. The dossier is the proof that the old guard is not just fighting back, they are winning. The Windsor Lodge controversy. The tension over the broader estate management found its most explosive point at the Royal Lodge. For months, news reports had swirled about the property's mounting maintenance costs and the complex, often opaque financial arrangements surrounding its occupancy. While the public focused on the controversies involving Prince Andrew, Princess Anne saw a deeper, more systemic problem. She recognized that the way the Queen's office had been handling these property leases was setting a dangerous precedent for the entire Windsor portfolio. The Queen's team had attempted to bypass the traditional oversight committees by negotiating private, informal adjustments to these leases. They wanted to show the King that they could resolve the Windsor problem quickly and quietly without the messy involvement of the senior advisors. They offered reduced rents and flexible terms, believing that this would maintain household harmony. To Princess Anne, this was an administrative disaster. She argued that the Crown's property rights were not a matter for private negotiation. They were assets that belonged to the institution, and they could not be bartered away to simplify a PR headache. Anne's intervention was swift. She gathered the files related to the Royal Lodge and discovered that the Queen's team had been granting unauthorized concessions that were never presented to the Privy Council. She found documentation of verbal agreements that held no legal weight but were being treated as binding contracts. This wasn't just poor management, it was a fundamental undermining of the Crown's legal standing. She saw how these lapses made the entire family look vulnerable to public scrutiny. When the Queen was confronted with these findings, she attempted to defend the actions as necessary for family peace. She argued that the monarchy needed to handle its internal business without constant, public-facing scrutiny. Anne remained unmoved. She reminded the Queen that the public's perception of royal property was the most important safeguard the institution had. If the people believed that royal assets were being mishandled behind closed doors, they would eventually stop supporting the funding that maintained them. The controversy quickly moved from the pages of the tabloids to the inner chambers of the castle. The king, who had initially stayed distant from the property disputes, found himself having to choose between his sister's insistence on procedural rigor and his wife's preference for quiet, internal resolutions. Anne's dossier proved that the Queen's approach had only invited more scrutiny, not less. The scandal surrounding the lodge became the primary evidence Anne used to argue that the Queen's office was not fit to manage the wider estate. The mystery that grew around the lodge was how much more was hidden in the files. Staff members began to wonder if other properties across the Windsor estate were being managed with the same informal, high-risk approach. The lack of transparency created an atmosphere of paranoia. Every decision from the Queen's office was now met with skepticism, not just from Anne, but from the wider household staff who were worried about the long-term legal repercussions. This controversy acted as the final catalyst for the Princess Royal. She realized that if she didn't step in now, the administrative erosion would spread to every corner of the Crown's portfolio. She began to mobilize the traditionalists within the household, creating a silent coalition that would soon challenge the Queen's authority over the entire estate. The lodge was no longer just a house. It was the battlefield where the future of royal property management was being decided. A clash of philosophies. The divide in Windsor is not just about paperwork. It is about two entirely different views on what the monarchy should be. Princess Anne represents the traditionalist core. She believes the crown is a responsibility to be stewarded, not an asset to be managed. For her, the Windsor estate is a sacred trust. It must be protected from commercial interests, administrative fluidity, and the modern appetite for quick financial wins. She views her duty as the preservation of a system that has served the family for centuries. Queen Camilla's office operates on a different frequency. They view the monarchy as a modern institution that must evolve to survive. They see the vast, sprawling royal estates not just as museums of history, but as resources that need to be optimized. This team, brought in by the Queen's office, consists of professional administrators. They speak the language of efficiency, market valuations, and strategic asset management. To them, an empty cottage on the estate is a wasted opportunity. To Anne, that same cottage is a part of the historical footprint of the crown. This fundamental clash of philosophies is what makes the standoff so explosive. Every policy suggestion from the Queen's team is met with a wall of resistance from Anne's camp. If the Queen's aides propose a new event space to drive revenue, Anne's team identifies the potential for security breaches. If they suggest modernizing a lease agreement, Anne's office flags the long-term risk to the Crown's underlying land rights. It is a constant grinding battle. The work of the household has slowed to a crawl. The staff in the middle of this are under immense pressure. They are caught between the authority of the Queen and the long-established influence of the Princess Royal. Some have chosen sides, while others have retreated to their own departments to avoid the heat. This has led to a fractured working environment. Key projects are stalled because departments refuse to communicate with one another. Decisions that should take a single day now take weeks of deliberation and political maneuvering. The King's position in all of this is becoming increasingly tenuous. He understands the need for modernization, but he also respects his sister's commitment to the institution's stability. He has tried to mediate, but the two women are now past the point of casual discussion. Every time he leans toward one side, the other interprets it as a betrayal. He is a king who wants a peaceful household, but he is presiding over a house that is at war with itself. The mystery that haunts the palace is whether the institution can withstand this internal strain. When the most senior members of a family are in open opposition, the cracks start to show in the public performance of the monarchy. The scrutiny from outside, particularly following the recent reports on property finances, only adds to the urgency. The world is watching the Crown's real estate portfolio, and the Crown is busy fighting over how to run it. Anne's team is not backing down. They have positioned themselves as the guardians of the institution's core identity. They have made it clear that they will oppose any measure that they believe compromises the legacy of the monarchy. The Queen's office is left trying to execute a modernizing agenda while being monitored by the most capable and determined figure in the family. The The clash is total, and there is no clear path to a resolution that keeps both sides happy. The philosophy of the past is currently holding the line against the philosophy of the present. The midnight confrontation. The clock in the royal library struck 12. The room was cold, lit only by the low glow of a single brass lamp. Princess Anne stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped behind her back. She was not there for a discussion. She was there to deliver an ultimatum. When the heavy oak door finally creaked open, the Queen entered alone. Her expression was guarded. She had been summoned to this meeting without her usual team of advisors. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of recent weeks. Anne did not offer a seat. She walked to the center of the rug and laid the Heritage Act dossier on the table. She opened it to the final page. It contained a single, handwritten note on official stationery. It was an order signed by the King, granting the Princess Royal temporary absolute authority over all internal operations at Windsor. It was the result of the audit she had presented days earlier. The evidence of administrative overreach had been too significant for the King to ignore. The Queen looked at the paper, then at the Princess. Her face paled. She had spent months building her influence within the castle walls, believing that her title gave her the right to reshape the monarchy's future. She had pushed for modernizing leases and reclassifying heritage spaces, thinking she was securing the institution's relevance. She had not anticipated that the old guard would fight back with such cold, clinical precision. Anne spoke clearly and without emotion. She laid out the terms. The Queen's direct control over the Windsor estate management was to end immediately. The projects she had initiated were to be placed under review by a committee led by the Princess herself. All access to the Central Archive was revoked for the Queen's private staff. The ultimatum was stark. The Queen could continue her public duties, but her influence over the internal architecture of the monarchy was gone. The Queen tried to protest. She argued that the monarchy needed to change, that the old ways were stifling. Anne cut her off. She did not argue about the theory of modernization. She kept the conversation grounded in the reality of the crown's survival. She reminded the Queen that an institution that loses its foundation does not evolve. It collapses. She told her that the King had seen the risks. He had chosen to prioritize the stability of the institution over the personal vision of his wife. The humiliation for the Queen was absolute. She was not being stripped of her title, but she was being stripped of the power she had worked so hard to acquire. Anne informed her that a new team would be moving into the administrative wing by morning. They would be auditing every contract, every lease, and every private agreement that the Queen's team had negotiated. Any deviation from the traditional charter would be reversed. As the Queen turned to leave, Anne had one final instruction. She told her that any further attempts to bypass the new council would be met with full public disclosure of the findings in the dossier. The threat was explicit. The Queen would be forced to face the consequences of her choices before the entire nation. It was a checkmate move that left the Queen with no room to maneuver. The power had shifted back to the traditionalists. The Queen walked out of the library and into the empty hallway. Her motorcade waited in the courtyard, but it now looked different. The familiar faces of her trusted aides were gone, replaced by palace security, who stood with rigid professional indifference. She had entered the castle as a power broker and left as a figurehead. The midnight meeting had achieved exactly what Anne intended. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant sound of a guard changing his post. Inside the castle, the staff were already receiving the new protocols. The era of the Queen's modernizing agenda at Windsor had come to an abrupt, silent end. Princess Anne had acted as the shield of the monarchy, just as she had for decades. She had defended the legacy she believed in, and in doing so, she had effectively neutralized the most significant challenge to the crown's internal order in a generation. The King's decision to sign that order was the final piece of the puzzle. It signaled a return to the values that the monarchy had relied on for centuries. The experiment was over. The estate would be managed according to the old rules, overseen by the person who knew them better than anyone else. The conflict that had roiled the palace was effectively settled in 1 hour of cold, hard truth. The mystery of how the family would reconcile after this remains. But for now, the internal structure is secure. The administration that had been so eager to dismantle the past now finds itself trapped by it. The Princess Royal has reasserted her role as the ultimate enforcer of the crown's traditions. She has protected the castle walls from the very people who were meant to guard them. The Windsor legacy remains, for better or worse, in the hands of the woman who would never dream of changing it. The security of the inner sanctum. The change in the atmosphere at Windsor was immediate and physical. By early morning, the administrative wing had been cordoned off. The doors that once opened for the Queen's aides were now guarded by a specialized security team reporting directly to Princess Anne. They were not members of the local Windsor detail. They were veteran officers, many of whom had served during the reign of the late Queen. Their presence served as a visible reminder that the new administration had been replaced by a return to the old order. Inside the wing, the Princess Royal's team moved with quiet efficiency. They began the process of demodernizing the office protocols. The digital booking systems that the Queen's team had implemented were shut down and replaced by traditional ledger entries. Every file, document, and schedule was pulled from the cloud and moved to secure, physical storage. They wanted to ensure that no digital trail remained that could be accessed or altered by outside parties. It was a digital, scorched earth policy. This process was not just about security. It was about reclaiming the space. The Queen's team had decorated the wing with modern art and open-plan desks, designed to foster a collaborative and tech-forward culture. Within 48 hours, the art was taken down, and the open-plan furniture was replaced with heavy, traditional mahogany desks. It was as if they were scrubbing away the recent past to return the building to its original state. The visual impact was clear to everyone who worked in the castle. The Queen's staff, who had previously felt confident and secure, found themselves locked out of their own offices. They were given until the end of the business day to collect their personal items under the supervision of a palace guard. They were not permitted to remove any files, laptops, or internal notes. Everything was cataloged and seized as crown property. For many, the reality of the situation only set in when they were escorted out through the side service entrance, away from the gaze of the press and the public. This move was a direct strike at the heart of the Queen's power structure. By cutting off her staff, Anne was effectively severing the Queen's ability to conduct business, manage her schedule, or communicate her directives. She had turned the administrative wing into a fortress. Anyone wishing to reach the Queen now had to go through Anne's own security filter. The princess had essentially placed the Queen under a form of administrative house arrest within her own residence. The mystery that continued to circulate through the lower ranks of the staff was where the Queen would go next. Her daily operations were frozen. She no longer had a team to manage her appointments or prepare her briefs. She was physically in the castle, but she was cut off from the machinery of her office. It was a strange, suspended state. She remained the Queen, but she was stripped of the means to exercise her daily authority. Anne's team didn't stop there. They began a deep dive audit of the security arrangements that the Queen had previously set up. They discovered that some of these arrangements had involved third-party contractors who had been given access to sensitive parts of the estate. These contracts were terminated instantly. The new security team systematically swept every room for listening devices and hidden digital trackers. They were looking for any sign of outside influence, as Anne described it in her briefings. The palace grounds, usually quiet, saw an increase in activity as the new security team established their perimeters. They were not there to greet guests or manage public tours. They were there to enforce the boundaries of the inner sanctum. The Princess Royal had made it clear. Windsor was to be treated as a sovereign space, not a commercial enterprise. The castle was back under the control of the traditionalist wing, and the security of that control was now the highest priority of the entire household. The King's silence. The King sat alone in his private study at the center of the castle. The room was heavy with the scent of old paper and beeswax. Outside, the world was moving on. Diplomats were drafting statements, and the press was chasing the latest rumors of palace dysfunction. But inside these walls, time seemed to have stopped. The King was the silent spectator to a transformation he had initially enabled, then watched spiral beyond his control. He sat at his desk, his hands resting on a stack of reports that detailed the final liquidation of his wife's administrative office. He had signed the order, and now he was living with the absolute stillness that followed. He remembered the early days of his reign. He had envisioned a monarchy that was lighter, more accessible, and firmly engaged with the realities of the 21st century. He had trusted his wife to help him craft that vision. They had talked for hours about how to open the estates to the public, how to streamline the archaic processes that define royal life, and how to make the monarchy feel like a modern, efficient institution. It was a shared dream, rooted in a desire to keep the crown relevant. Now, looking at the empty office wing across the corridor, he realized that he had underestimated the sheer, immovable weight of the institution he had been born to lead. The Princess Royal had never been a radical. She was a stabilizer. She understood that for a monarchy to survive, it must be predictable, resilient, and steeped in the continuity of its own history. She had not acted out of malice. She had acted out of a conviction that the changes the king and queen were pushing were not just misguided, but dangerous. She had proved that their modernization efforts were creating structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited by external forces. When she laid the facts before him, the broken charters, the informal leases, the security lapses, he had found himself unable to argue against her. To defend his wife was to defend a process he now understood was flawed. To support his sister was to watch the dismantling of his own vision. He chose the latter, not because he lacked love for his wife, but because he was, first and foremost, a monarch whose loyalty was to the throne itself. The silence in the study was not just the absence of sound, it was the weight of his own realization. He was a king who reigned over a kingdom, but he had discovered he was a monarch who could not manage his own household. Every directive he issued now was filtered through the new committee that his sister had established. He would ask for a report, and he would receive it, but only after it had been vetted, verified, and cross-referenced against the traditional royal charters. He was being protected from his own decisions. It was a strange, gilded cage of his own making. He watched his wife move through the house with a quiet, resigned grace, no longer discussing the estate or the future of the monarchy. They were living in a marriage that had become a casualty of the very institution they both served. The palace staff observed him with a mixture of reverence and pity. They saw a man who was burdened by the impossible task of balancing a life of love with a life of duty. He was more introspective, spending longer hours staring out at the manicured lawns that had become the symbols of this bitter, silent war. He appeared less frequently at the public ceremonies that had once been his comfort. He was a man managing the weight of an ancient institution, watching as his family dynamic was reshaped by the very forces he had hoped to reconcile. His silence was a signal to everyone in the household, from the highest-ranking aides to the lowest members of the support staff, that the struggle was over, and the outcome was not up for debate. There was a mystery that haunted the private hallways. Was this silence a sign of a broken spirit? Or was it a calculated retreat? Some of the older courtiers, those who remembered the reign of his mother, believed the king was performing a masterclass in royal endurance. They whispered that he was stepping back, letting his sister do the necessary, brutal work of house cleaning, so that he would not have to bear the personal cost of the unpopular decisions. By letting Anne dismantle the modernizing agenda, he kept his own hands clean. He remained the benevolent king, while his sister took on the role of the necessary enforcer. If this was true, then his silence was not a weakness. It was the ultimate cold-blooded strategy of survival. It allowed the monarchy to return to its foundations without forcing him to openly betray the woman he loved. Yet, as he sat there, he could not help but feel the absence of what might have been. He looked at the photographs on his desk, images of a time before the dossier, before the midnight confrontation, before the administrative wing was locked and cleared. He was a king who possessed immense wealth and historical significance, but he was currently stripped of the power to change even the smallest aspect of his own home. He had kept his throne, he had kept the dignity of the office, and he had secured the institution for the next generation. But the cost was the quiet life he had imagined for himself. He was the occupant of a throne that required the sacrifice of his own personal autonomy. The groundskeeper walked past the window, shears in hand, tending to the roses as he had done for 40 years. The king watched him, realizing that the monarchy, like the garden, only thrived when it was pruned back to its roots. The growth, the new vibrant, chaotic expansion he had tried to plant, had been cut away to ensure the health of the core. It was a bitter medicine, but it worked. The house was quiet. The rebellion had been extinguished. The structure was sound. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, deep shadows across the room, the king finally closed his eyes. He remained silent, for there was nothing left to say that would not break the fragile, cold peace that had finally descended upon the castle. He was the king, and for now, that was enough. The battle over the Windsor estate is far more than a debate over leases and property maintenance. It is a fundamental struggle for the soul of the British monarchy. Princess Anne's intervention signals a shift in power that the institution hasn't seen in generations, a move toward protecting the old guard vision at any cost. With the family's unity hanging in the balance, one thing is certain: the era of polite disagreements is over. As the fallout from this standoff continues to ripple through the palace, we have to ask, will the monarchy be stronger for this internal check, or are we witnessing the beginning of an irreparable divide?